Still the clink of silverware echoed at the dinner table, as my son finally said what he'd been holding in for years. As I tightened my grip on the wine glass, I kept my voice calm, a father refusing to let anger lead. While the silverware kept tapping plates, I felt each sound underline how far we drifted as father and son. The same quiet clinking carried memories of everything I'd built for him, and everything he believed I'd denied him. That's when I realized his words weren't just anger, they were a verdict he'd already passed on me. Still listening to that sound, I decided if he wanted to stand alone, I would finally let him. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The dinner table was quiet, save for the clinking of silverware against plates and the faint hum of the evening outside. It was a typical night in the Bradford household: expensive wine, carefully curated dishes, and the semblance of a family that had it all together. But beneath the surface, something was brewing, simmering, ready to explode. Lucas, his jaw clenched tight, had been unusually silent. His eyes darted between his father Henry and his mother Victoria. He couldn't hold it in any longer. The frustration, the resentment, it had built up over years of living in his father's shadow, of constantly feeling like he wasn't enough. The words were harsh, but they spilled out like poison. "You always treat me like I'm a failure," Lucas snapped, his voice trembling with anger. His eyes burned with a mix of pain and rage as he looked at Henry, his own father, the man he had once tried to emulate. "You act like I'm just some screw-up, while your golden boy of a father-in-law did it all on his own. Unlike you." Henry's face paled, the shock evident. He had heard the anger before, but this accusation, this comparison, hit deeper than anything Lucas had said before. His hands tightened around his glass of wine, but he didn't raise his voice. He wouldn't let Lucas see how much it stung. "That's not what I've ever said," Henry replied, his voice steady, but the hurt in his eyes betrayed him. "I've always tried to help you, Lucas. I've always been there." Lucas shook his head, his voice rising. "No, you've never been there for me, not really. You helped when it suited you, when it made you feel like you were still in control. But you don't get it, do you? You think I've had it easy, that everything's been handed to me. But it hasn't been, not like it was for him, for Douglas." Henry's face tightened at the mention of Victoria's father. The very man Lucas seemed to idolize, the very man who had built his empire from nothing. The comparison stung, as it always did. Henry had worked hard to build his own success, but Lucas couldn't see it. He never could. Victoria, sensing the conversation was spiraling, tried to intervene. "Lucas, please, don't say that. Your father has done nothing but try to help you. We're a family. We're supposed to." But Lucas wasn't listening. His anger had boiled over, and now it was all spilling out. "Help, you call it help? He's never let me stand on my own. Every time I try to do something for myself, it's like he's ready to swoop in and take control. What have you ever done alone, Dad? Huh? Everything you've achieved has been with someone else's hand guiding you, whether it's your business partners or your precious father-in-law. You've never done it alone." Henry's grip on his wine glass tightened. He was shocked, more by the depth of Lucas's words than anything else. Hurt lingered in his chest, but he knew if he gave in now, it would only escalate. He looked at Victoria, her face drawn, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and confusion. "I've done everything I can for you," Henry said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I've done it because I care. But if this is how you see it, maybe I've been wrong." The words hung heavy in the air. Lucas's chest heaved with frustration, but before he could say anything more, he stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with a sharp scrape against the floor. "This is pointless," he muttered, his face flushed with rage. "You'll never understand, you'll never get it." Without another word, he stormed out of the room, leaving the two of them sitting there, the weight of the argument still thick between them. The clink of the silverware had long since stopped, replaced by the deafening silence. Victoria looked at Henry, her face a mixture of concern and disappointment. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Henry sat back, his eyes unfocused as the reality of the conversation settled in. His relationship with Lucas had always been complicated, but never like this. Had he been too harsh? Had he pushed his son too far? The guilt gnawed at him, but the anger, Lucas's anger, felt like an accusation he couldn't ignore. He sat there for a long while, staring at the empty chair where his son had been, the tension from the evening hanging in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Then with a slow, deliberate exhale, Henry made a decision. His jaw set, his eyes hardening with resolve. He wouldn't offer Lucas any more help, not anymore. Not if it meant his son would always resent him for it. If Lucas was going to change, he would have to do it on his own. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the empty breakfast table. The air was still heavy with the residue of last night's argument, and Henry hadn't slept much. He didn't even remember when he'd finally gone to bed, only that the tension from the dinner still gripped him like a vice. He hadn't heard from Lucas, but he wasn't sure he wanted to. His mind kept replaying the words, the accusations. "You've never done it alone." Then the phone buzzed. The message was brief, the words carefully chosen, but the underlying tone was unmistakable. "Dad, I was wrong, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said those things. I need help, please. Can we talk?" Henry stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the reply button. The apology felt hollow, like a concession born more of desperation than remorse. The hurt was still fresh, the betrayal too raw. He hadn't seen it coming, hadn't expected Lucas to go so far. And now here was his son, back in the same pattern, asking for help, just like always. Henry set the phone down, his face hardening as he leaned back in his chair. Help. Was this how it always went? Lucas would screw up, lash out, and then return, expecting to be bailaid out. His hands clenched, a surge of anger bubbling beneath the surface. He'd done enough. Too much. Victoria entered the room, her presence as heavy as the silence that hung between them. She hadn't said much last night, but she didn't need to. The look on her face said it all. Her son, her flesh and blood, had come to a breaking point, and now she was trying to hold the family together. "You're not going to respond, are you?" Her voice was soft, almost resigned, but it cut through the tension. Henry didn't look at her. "I've already said everything I needed to say." "You can't just shut him out, Henry. You can't leave him like this. He's your son." I've tried for years, Victoria." Henry's voice was colder now, his words clipped. "But he never learns. He always comes back asking for more. I won't do it anymore." Victoria's face twisted in pain. She had seen this before, Henry's stubbornness, his refusal to bend, even when it came to his own flesh and blood. "You can't just turn your back on him like this. It'll destroy your relationship with him." Henry didn't respond. He couldn't. The idea of continuing this toxic cycle, of being the crutch Lucas had always leaned on, made him feel sick. His son had to figure it out for himself. Later that morning, Henry met with his lawyer. The conversation was formal, sterile, and cold. His lawyer listened intently as Henry laid out his decision. "I want to make sure Lucas doesn't inherit a thing unless he proves himself. If he's going to learn, he needs to see the consequences of his actions. He needs to earn it." The lawyer nodded, making notes. "Understood. I'll draft the necessary changes to the will." Henry's jaw tightened as the lawyer spoke. The consequences of his actions. It was the only way. Meanwhile, Lucas, feeling the weight of his father's silence, sank further into his own despair. The feeling of abandonment gnawed at him, but his pride wouldn't let him reach out again, not to his father. He needed guidance, someone who could offer him a way forward without judgment. And so, he turned to the one man who had always seemed to have it all together, his father-in-law, Douglas. Douglas's office was as grand as the man himself, polished, imposing, the very picture of old money and self-made success. Lucas hesitated in the doorway, his mind swirling with doubt. But Douglas, ever the pragmatist, gestured for him to sit. "What's going on, Lucas?" Douglas asked, his voice cool but not unkind. "You've been a mess lately." Lucas sank into the chair, his shoulders slumped. "I don't know what to do anymore. I've screwed everything up. I need help, Doug, but not from my father." Douglas paused, studying Lucas with sharp eyes. "I'm not giving you money, Lucas. That's not the kind of help you need. You need to learn how to fix your own mistakes. No one can do that for you." The words stung, but Lucas held back his anger. He needed advice, not handouts. "I get that," he muttered. "I just don't know where to start." Douglas leaned back in his chair, considering. "You need to own your mistakes, really own them. And you need to stop running to your father every time you hit a bump in the road. You've got to stand on your own, or you'll never get out of this cycle." Lucas sat in silence, the weight of his father-in-law's words sinking in. It wasn't the assurance he had hoped for, but it was the truth. Back at the house, Henry kept his distance. He heard about Lucas's struggles, but it didn't move him. His son's choices were his own, and if Lucas was going to sink or swim, it was up to him now. The silence between them stretched out longer with each passing day. And as Henry watched from a distance, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was it. That this time, the rift between them might be too deep to ever repair. The weeks dragged on in the Bradford household, each day heavier than the last. The silence between father and son became its own presence, a cold, suffocating wall neither Henry nor Lucas seemed willing to break. Dinner was often taken in solitude, conversations were sparse, and when they did happen they were loaded with tension, each word a reminder of the rift that had grown too wide to ignore. Neither Henry nor Lucas spoke about it directly, but they both felt the distance, painfully, constantly. Lucas's business ventures, once filled with the spark of ambition, began to crumble under the weight of his mounting failures. His latest project, a risky startup, hadn't even reached its first year before sinking into debt. Desperation took root. He could feel his reputation slipping through his fingers, his self-worth crumbling with each failure. Every phone call to investors, every pitch to potential partners ended in rejection. He knew his father was watching from a distance, silently judging, and that only fueled his need to prove himself. But the more he tried, the harder it became to convince anyone, including himself, that he was capable of succeeding without his father's help. Henry, though aware of Lucas's struggles, kept his distance, emotionally and financially. He heard the whispers, friends, acquaintances, even Victoria mentioned it occasionally, but he refused to let himself feel pity. He made his bed, Henry thought, now he has to lie in it. His decision to step back from Lucas wasn't easy, but it felt necessary. He had given his son enough chances, enough resources, and it had always come back to the same place. Lucas was always looking for a way out. Henry had made up his mind. This time no more. Victoria, caught in the middle, could feel the fracture growing deeper. Every time she looked at Henry, she saw the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to help, but his pride kept him rooted in stubbornness. She couldn't ignore the tension between the two men she loved most in the world. But each time she brought it up, Henry shut her down, his resolve growing stronger with every passing day. "You can't just leave him to drown, Henry," she said one evening, her voice pleading. "He's your son. He's making mistakes, yes, but this coldness between you two, it's destroying him." Henry turned his gaze away from her, focusing on the glass of whiskey in front of him. "He needs to learn," he muttered, the words heavy with finality. "He needs to face the consequences of his actions. I can't keep saving him. Not anymore." But Victoria didn't relent. "You're not saving him, Henry. You're just abandoning him. He doesn't have anyone else." Lucas, meanwhile, sank deeper into a cycle of risky decisions. Desperation clouded his judgment, pushing him to take chances that had once seemed too reckless even for him. A series of bad investments, a failed partnership, and mounting debts. Each decision, a desperate attempt to prove he wasn't the failure his father believed him to be. But the more he tried, the more it seemed like the universe was conspiring against him. His pride, once a driving force, had become a weight that dragged him deeper into a pit of bitterness. He reached out to Douglas again, seeking guidance, but the older man, despite his wealth of experience, stayed uninvolved. He'd offered advice, but financial help was off the table. "Lucas," he'd said, his voice matter of fact, "you've got to take responsibility. You want respect. You have to earn it. I'm not going to bail you out. No one is." But Lucas didn't hear the wisdom in those words. Not anymore. His resentment, fueled by the constant comparisons to his father-in-law, only grew with each day. He was becoming a stranger to himself, a man ruled by bitterness and pride, further distancing himself from his father's unyielding expectations. And as Henry stood apart, watching from the sidelines, he couldn't shake the feeling that things had gone too far. Could he even step back in now, or had the damage been done? The morning of the leak felt like any other at first. Henry sat at the breakfast table, reading through a financial report, unaware that his life was about to shatter in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Then, the phone rang. Victoria's voice on the other end was strained, almost unrecognizable. "Henry, you need to see this. Now." Confusion twisted in his gut as he clicked through the link she'd sent. The headline jumped out at him. Bradford Enterprises, a legacy built on lies, scandals, and deceptive practices exposed. His heart sank, his hands shaking as he read the damning details. The article outlined questionable business practices, shady deals that traced back to Henry's early days in business, and accusations of unethical manipulation of financial records. It was everything Lucas had feared for years, everything Henry had kept buried. And now it was on the front page of every major news outlet. Henry's blood ran cold as the implications settled in. The press frenzy had begun. His phone was buzzing nonstop, messages of concern, threats of legal action, and worst of all, questions about his integrity. This wasn't just a business problem, it was a personal one, one that would follow him forever. His reputation, the foundation of everything he had built, was crumbling before his eyes. The phone rang again, this time from his lawyer. "Henry, this situation is escalating fast. You need to prepare for a public fallout. We're looking at lawsuits, potential investigations. This could destroy you if we don't act quickly." Henry gripped the phone, the weight of it all pressing down on him. "How did this happen?" he muttered under his breath, the realization dawning. Lucas. It had to be Lucas. His suspicions were confirmed when Victoria arrived, her face pale and tired from hours of crying and trying to process the chaos. "It's him, isn't it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry didn't answer. He couldn't. He knew. He'd seen the signs, heard the bitterness in Lucas's voice, the resentment that had simmered under the surface for months. But this was something else. This was betrayal in its rawest form. The door slammed open. Lucas stood there, his face set in stone, as if he was daring Henry to say something, anything. But there was no anger in his eyes anymore, just something darker. Regret. Henry couldn't tell. "What have you done?" Victoria's voice cracked as she stepped forward, her eyes filled with disbelief. "Lucas, this is insane. You've destroyed your father, our family. You've ruined everything." Lucas shifted uncomfortably, but his eyes never wavered. "I didn't have a choice. You both never understood. You never saw how hard I worked, how much I tried. You never saw me as anything more than a failure." His voice grew louder, the bitterness still thick in the air. "I had to do something. I had to make you see me, to make you understand." Victoria's face crumpled with pain as she reached out to him. This isn't the way to get attention, Lucas. You're hurting everyone. Please, take responsibility for your actions before it's too late." But Lucas didn't move. He didn't even look at her. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Henry and Victoria to stare at the damage left in his wake. Douglas, as expected, stayed silent. He had always been the one to teach Lucas that actions had consequences, yet he refused to intervene now. "He made his bed," Douglas had said earlier that day, his tone cold and unbothered. "Let him lie in it." Henry sat in the silence that followed, his mind spinning. How had it come to this? Had he been so focused on his own pride, his own success, that he had pushed Lucas too far? The thought gnawed at him. Had his decisions, his need to prove himself, led to this moment? He tried to push the thoughts away, but the questions kept coming. Lucas, meanwhile, was drowning in his own regret. He hadn't anticipated the full scope of the damage, and the weight of what he'd done was beginning to crush him. But pride, his unyielding pride, kept him from reaching out. He couldn't apologize, not yet. The future now seemed even more uncertain than before, a fog of bitterness and broken trust. And neither father nor son knew how, or if, this could ever be repaired. The days following the leak felt like a blur, a slow-motion crash of everything Henry had worked for. The media had exploded, the headlines unrelenting, and the public's perception of him began to crumble. The trust he had so carefully built, both in business and in his personal life, was slipping through his fingers. The accusations of deceit, the shady dealings, they painted a picture that no amount of money or influence could easily erase. But the worst part was the source, his own son. The betrayal stung deeper than anything the press could print. Henry had always known there was tension, knew Lucas had resented him, but he never imagined his son would go so far as to publicly tear down everything he had built. He sat in his office late at night, staring at the glowing screen, trying to ignore the phone's constant buzzing with notifications, messages, calls. His reputation, his legacy, felt like it was slipping out of his hands. And Lucas had handed it all over to the vultures without a second thought. Victoria entered quietly, her face drawn with worry. She had been trying to reach him all day, but Henry had shut himself off from everyone. "Henry, you need to talk to him, to Luke." As she urged gently, her voice trembling with a mix of sadness and desperation. "This can't go on. You're losing him, and you're losing yourself in the process." Henry didn't respond immediately. His gaze was fixed on the wall, his mind lost in a fog of anger and confusion. He couldn't even bring himself to look at her. "He's gone too far, Victoria," he finally said, his voice hoarse, weary. "I can't just forgive him for this. Not this. Not when he's torn apart everything we've worked for." She stepped closer, her hand resting on his shoulder, but he shrugged it off. "You can't just shut him out. He's your son. He needs you." Henry's eyes hardened as he turned to face her, the weight of his decision weighing on him like a boulder. "No, he needs to learn, Victoria. This is the consequence of his actions. He's made his choice." Meanwhile, Lucas's world was unraveling just as fast as his father's. His financial struggles were no longer just whispers. His debts were mounting. The businesses he'd poured everything into were failing. The weight of his failures pressed down on him, and he found himself sinking deeper into desperation. Loans he couldn't repay, deals that had gone south, and no one to turn to except his own pride. He couldn't turn to Henry, not after what he'd done. So he turned elsewhere. Risky investments. High-stakes bets. Anything to make the pain stop, to prove he wasn't the failure his father thought him to be. But each choice seemed to dig him deeper into a hole he couldn't escape. Douglas, ever the pragmatist, had made his position clear. "You've dug yourself into this hole, Lucas. You have to get out on your own." His words were calm, but they carried the weight of a final judgment. No handouts, no bailouts, just cold, hard reality. But it didn't matter. Lucas didn't hear him anymore. The bitterness that had festered for years had turned into something else, a wild, reckless determination. He wasn't just fighting for success now. He was fighting for his father's approval, for his place in the world. And he would do whatever it took to get it. Henry, meanwhile, began to retreat further into himself. The pressure of the public backlash was suffocating. Friends turned away, colleagues distanced themselves, and he felt his isolation growing with each passing day. He started avoiding even Victoria, shutting her out as well. Her constant pleas to reach out to Lucas only reminded him of how much he had lost, and he couldn't bear to face her disappointment too. Victoria, heartbroken, watched as her husband began to isolate himself more and more. She felt the walls between them grow, and with each silent night, She feared that the rift between father and son had become a chasm that neither would be able to cross. "I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this," she whispered to herself late one evening, staring at Henry's back as he sank deeper into his own world. And as the days passed, Henry couldn't shake the question that tormented him. Had he made the right decision? Had his refusal to help Lucas, to step in when his son needed him, really been the right call? Or had it simply driven a wedge too deep to fix? The weight of his choices pressed down on him, and he knew deep down that it might already be too late. Lucas's world had finally collapsed. His business was gone, the loans were overdue, and the creditors were knocking on his door. But now it wasn't just his finances on the line. His personal life was unraveling too. Legal papers piled up on his desk, each one more damning than the last. A lawsuit from a former business partner, another from an investor who felt swindled. The weight of it all crushed him in a way he hadn't anticipated. The life he had worked so hard to build, the empire he had tried to create, now it was all turning to dust. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the stack of documents, feeling like the walls were closing in around him. Each envelope felt like a hammer blow to his pride. His father's betrayal still echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of how he'd gone too far, how he'd burned every bridge between them. The idea of asking for help seemed impossible, but desperation had a way of breaking through pride. Across town, Victoria was torn. She'd watched Henry's slow withdrawal, his decision to stand firm in the wake of Lucas's betrayal. She could see the way it ate at him, the way his anger toward Lucas hardened every time she mentioned the boy. But Victoria knew what was at stake. Henry was still the one person who could help. The choice was clear, but Henry's refusal to bend, to reach out to his son, made her question how much longer their marriage could survive. "You have to do something," she pleaded, her voice breaking the stillness of the room. "You can't let him drown, Henry. He's your son. Don't you remember when he was little, when you would do anything for him?" Henry's jaw clenched as he looked at her, his eyes betraying the internal conflict he had been avoiding for so long. "He betrayed me, Victoria. He destroyed everything, my reputation, my business. I can't just forget that." "But you've been punishing him for weeks," she said, stepping closer to him. "And I know you're angry, but what are you going to do? Let him destroy himself?" Henry turned away from her, his gaze shifting to the window where the world seemed to carry on without care. "I don't know," he muttered, the weight of his own indecision pressing on him. "I don't know if I can forgive him." As the days passed, Lucas finally reached out. His voice on the other end of the phone was different this time, calm, subdued. Gone was the anger, the pride. There was only a quiet desperation. "Dad," Lucas began, the words slow and heavy, "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for anything, really, but I need help. I don't know what else to do." The rawness in his son's voice hit Henry like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he was tempted to say something, to offer even a sliver of reassurance. But the pain, the betrayal, lingered too heavily in his chest. Henry sat there, the phone pressing against his ear, trying to reconcile the man who had caused him so much pain with the son who now seemed to be asking for redemption. His mind raced. Could he really go through with this? Helping Lucas would mean reopening old wounds, inviting in the very thing he had been trying to avoid. But at the same time, Henry couldn't ignore the son who had once looked up to him, the boy who had needed him in ways that Henry had failed to see. Victoria's voice echoed in his mind, urging him to reach out, to repair what had been broken. But the trust had been shattered. How could he possibly rebuild it? Lucas, humiliated and broken, didn't push for an answer. He didn't ask for much, only a chance. A chance to try, a chance to rebuild himself. And for the first time, Henry could hear the regret, the true regret in his son's voice. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about redemption, about starting over. Henry's eyes closed, his mind heavy with the decision that lay before him. "I'll help you," he finally said, his voice tight, "but it won't be easy. I'm doing this on my terms, Lucas. You'll have to prove to me that you've learned, that you've changed." The silence on the other end of the phone was thick. Then, quietly, Lucas whispered, "I'll do whatever it takes, Dad." But even as Henry agreed to help, a part of him couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this might be the start of another betrayal. The first few weeks of Lucas's attempt to rebuild his life were grueling. The weight of his past mistakes loomed over every step, every decision. It was a constant struggle, facing creditors, dealing with the fallout from the failed business ventures, and trying to repair his shattered reputation. But this time, Lucas was different. He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't looking for shortcuts or bailouts. Every move he made felt deliberate, even if the progress was slow, painful. The weight of the damage he had caused hung over him like a cloud that wouldn't disperse. Henry watched from the sidelines, unsure of what to believe. He'd agreed to help, but that didn't mean he trusted his son. Lucas had disappointed him too many times, and the scars of their past conflicts were still fresh. Every time he saw Lucas trying to rebuild, Henry's mind filled with doubts. Was this real? Was this just another act? His son's words, his attempts to show remorse, they seemed genuine, but how could he be sure? Henry had seen the facade before. He had seen Lucas promise change only to fall back into old habits. Was he really different this time? Or was this just another attempt to win his favor? Victoria, caught between her husband and her son, felt the tension in every corner of their home. She could see the changes in Lucas, his newfound humility, the way he was throwing himself into work, taking responsibility for his actions. But she could also see Henry's reluctance to fully embrace this shift. How could he? After everything Lucas had done, after the way he'd torn their family apart, how could Henry let go of the anger that still simmered beneath the surface? She tried gently to push Henry toward reconciliation. "He's trying, Henry, he really is. You've seen it too." Her voice was soft, almost pleading. "You need to let him in. If you keep holding back, you'll lose him forever." But Henry just stared out the window, lost in his thoughts. "It's not that simple," he muttered. "I can't just forget everything that's happened. I don't know if I can ever trust him again." Douglas, who had been keeping a watchful eye from the sidelines, finally stepped in. He'd always been the pragmatist, the voice of reason, but even he couldn't ignore the slow progress Lucas was making. "You've got to make a decision, Henry," he said one evening, his voice calm but firm. "You can't keep standing in the middle of this. You either try to fix it or you let it go, but you can't have it both ways." Henry didn't respond immediately, but his gaze softened just a fraction. He had known Douglas long enough to hear the truth beneath his words. Maybe it was time to try again. Maybe. As the days passed, Henry found himself watching Lucas more closely. It wasn't easy. Every time he saw his son trying to mend the mess he had created, Henry's anger and disappointment flared again. But there were moments, small, subtle moments, where Lucas showed signs of genuine growth. He was no longer asking for handouts. He wasn't running from his mistakes. He was facing them head-on, as hard as it was. One evening, Henry found himself sitting across from Lucas, the space between them thick with unspoken words. Lucas's eyes were tired, but there was something else there too, something Henry hadn't seen before. Remorse. He couldn't be sure. "I've hurt you, Dad," Lucas began, his voice rough but steady. "I've hurt this family, and I can't undo that, but I'm trying. I'm really trying to be better." Henry swallowed, the words sticking in his throat. For a moment he wanted to lash out, to remind Lucas of everything he had destroyed. But he didn't. Instead, he looked at his son and said, "I don't know if I can ever forget what you did. I don't know if I can ever trust you fully again." Lucas's face fell, but he didn't flinch. "I understand. I just want the chance to make it right, to prove that I'm not the person I was." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of their past. But for the first time in months, there was a flicker of something else in Henry's chest, something like hope. A tiny seed, barely visible, but it was there. And as they sat there, neither sure of where the conversation would go next, they both knew something had shifted. But whether it was enough to heal the wounds of the past, only time would tell. Just when it seemed like Lucas was finally gaining some ground, another crisis hit. It came out of nowhere, an unexpected blow that threatened to undo everything he had worked for. The new business venture, the one that had been his lifeline, began to falter. A key investor pulled out at the last minute, and without that funding, the entire project was on the brink of collapse. Lucas could feel the walls closing in on him again, the crushing weight of failure pressing down harder than ever before. His past mistakes, once seemingly in the distance, came rushing back with full force. Victoria, watching from the sidelines, felt the familiar dread creeping into her heart. She'd seen Lucas claw his way back before, but this time the stakes were higher. This time the recovery didn't just mean salvaging a business. It meant saving his relationship with his father, his dignity, his future. And yet, with every setback, every new hurdle, she could see the fragile thread of hope beginning to snap. She feared that no matter how hard Lucas tried, no matter how much he changed, the damage between him and Henry might be irreparable. The thought of it made her heart heavy. She turned to Henry, her voice low but desperate. "This could be it, Henry. If Lucas fails now, I don't know how we'll ever come back from this. I don't know how you'll ever look at him the same again." Henry was silent, his mind in turmoil. He had tried to help, he had extended a hand to his son, but now, as he saw the situation slipping out of their control, he began to doubt whether his decision to step in had been the right one. Had I given him enough? What if this was all a mistake? The thought haunted him. He had hoped Lucas was truly ready to stand on his own, to prove he was capable. But every time Lucas took a step forward, it seemed like something yanked him 2 steps back. Douglas, sensing the growing tension, stepped in again, offering his usual brand of cold, unflinching advice. "You're at a crossroads, Henry," he said, his voice pragmatic, offering no comfort but an undeniable clarity. "Lucas is going to have to take some drastic action, and it's not going to be pretty, but if you want him to truly prove himself, you need to let him make the hard choices, even if it costs him everything." Henry turned to look at his father-in-law, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the weight of those words. Let him risk everything. Again. The idea terrified him, but there was a part of him, a small part, that knew Douglas was right. If Lucas was ever going to break free of the past, he would have to face it head-on, no matter the cost. And so Lucas made his move. In a moment of desperation, he put everything on the line, his last remaining assets, a risky loan, and a deal with an unpredictable investor who could either be his salvation or his complete undoing. It was a gamble, one that could either lift him back to his feet or bury him for good. The tension in his chest was almost unbearable, but he knew this was his only chance to prove he wasn't a failure, to prove to himself, and to his father, that he was capable of standing on his own. Henry watched from the sidelines, his heart pounding as he saw Lucas take the risk. He wanted to stop him, to pull him back from the edge, but something inside him held him back. Let him do this, he thought. Let him face the consequences of his choices. And yet, a deep fear gnawed at him. What if this was the final mistake, the one Lucas couldn't recover from? Victoria stood beside Henry, her hand gently resting on his arm. Her unwavering support was all that kept him from breaking. She knew this was a turning point, maybe the turning point, but like him, she couldn't shake the feeling that the future was still so uncertain. As the days passed, Lucas's decision loomed large. The outcome was still unclear, but one thing was certain: this gamble would either solidify his redemption or destroy it completely. And for the first time in months, Henry allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of something new, but he couldn't know for sure. Not yet. Not until the dust settled. It had been months since Lucas made the gamble that could either save or destroy everything. The risk, the tension, the unknown. It had all been a weight on his shoulders, but now, slowly, it was paying off. His business was recovering, his creditors were beginning to ease up, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Lucas saw the possibility of redemption on the horizon. But for Henry, watching his son from the sidelines, the feeling was bittersweet. Yes, there were signs of progress, signs that Lucas was trying, truly trying, but the scars were still there. They hadn't healed, not by a long shot. Henry sat at the kitchen table, eyes fixed on his son as Lucas made another call, this one less desperate, more confident. But the voice inside Henry's head, the voice of all the years of disappointment, kept whispering, can he really change? Is this real, or is it just another act? The pain of the past clung to him like a second skin. How could he just forget the betrayal, the way Lucas had torn apart their family? The thought seemed impossible. Victoria, sensing the hesitation in her husband, approached him quietly. Her voice was gentle but firm. Henry, you need to let go of the past. I see what he's doing. I see how hard he's trying. You have to trust him, even if it's hard. You can't keep holding onto that anger forever. If we don't start moving forward, we'll all be stuck in the past. Henry turned to her, his face a mixture of frustration and sorrow. He knew she was right, but it didn't make it any easier. The wounds were still too raw. I'm trying, Victoria. I really am, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I don't know if I can forgive him. I don't know if I can trust him again. She sighed, sitting beside him, placing her hand on his. I know it's hard, but holding on to that anger won't fix anything. It will only keep us apart. You have to let him show you that he's changed. That's the only way to heal. Henry looked at her, his eyes full of uncertainty, but something in his chest shifted just a little. He wasn't ready to forgive completely. He couldn't be. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could take the first steps toward healing. Later that evening, Lucas made a gesture that spoke louder than words ever could. He sat down across from Henry, his eyes steady but vulnerable. I've messed up. I know that, he began, his voice filled with raw honesty. I hurt you, I hurt Mom, and I can't undo any of it, but I'm not that person anymore. I'm trying to do better. I want to be better. The words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long time, Henry saw the sincerity in his son's eyes. There were no excuses, no deflections, just a man admitting his faults and taking responsibility for them. It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. Henry's heart clenched. There was still so much pain, so much betrayal that lingered between them, but he couldn't ignore the flicker of hope in his chest. He didn't know if he could forgive Lucas right now, but he also knew that forgiveness was the only way they could move forward. It was the only way they could rebuild the broken pieces of their family. As the days passed, the family took small steps toward healing. Conversations that once felt like landmines were now cautiously navigated. Trust was being rebuilt, brick by brick, even though the foundation was still shaky. It wasn't easy, and there were moments where old wounds bled fresh again, but for the first time, there was hope. Lucas wasn't perfect. Neither was Henry. But they were learning slowly that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about moving forward with the knowledge that, even though they had hurt each other, there was still a chance for redemption. And as the family sat down for dinner that night, the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a bridge. Fragile, yes, but there. It was a new beginning, and while they all knew the road ahead would still be difficult, they were ready to walk it together. But as the meal continued, Henry's thoughts lingered on one thing. Could this really be the start of something new? Could they truly leave the past behind, or would it always haunt them? Only time would tell. The weight of Lucas's decision hung over him like a storm cloud, dark and unyielding. He had spent days, maybe weeks, considering his next move, but now it was time to act. The offer on the table was a lifeline, an opportunity to finally break free of his past mistakes. A new venture, one that could restore his reputation, give him a second chance. But it came at a cost. He had to make a choice that would change the course of his future for better or worse. As Lucas stood in the dim light of his office, staring at the contract in front of him, his mind raced. This could be the moment he had been waiting for, an escape from the pit he had dug for himself. But the cost was high. The deal would require him to put everything on the line again, his future, his finances, his relationship with his father. It felt like a gamble, one he wasn't sure he could afford to lose. But could he keep living like this, constantly looking over his shoulder, always running from the past? Or was it time to step into the future, even if it meant risking everything. Meanwhile, Henry sat in the study, his thoughts a storm of their own. He had spent so much of his life building a wall between himself and Lucas. That wall had protected him, kept him from the pain of his son's mistakes, from the fear of being betrayed again. But now, as he listened to Victoria's voice pleading from the doorway, that wall seemed less like protection and more like a prison. "You need to make a decision, Henry," Victoria said, her voice tight with the strain of months of uncertainty. "You can't keep holding back. Lucas is trying. He's finally showing you he's willing to change. If you can't forgive him now, if you can't let him in, I don't know what's left for the two of you." Henry turned to her, his face drawn with the weight of the choice he had been avoiding. "I don't know if I can do it, Victoria. I don't know if I can risk my heart again. Every time I let him in, he disappoints me." Victoria's eyes softened, but there was an edge to her voice. "You're punishing him for what he's done. You're punishing yourself too. If you keep holding on to that anger, you'll lose him forever. You have to decide, Henry. You have to choose him or the past." The words hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Henry's heart twisted as he thought of the years of disappointment, the lies, the broken trust. But deep down, a voice inside him whispered that he couldn't keep living this way, frozen in time, bound by old wounds. What was he holding on to? Lucas, still grappling with his own doubts, reached out for help, but not from Henner. Why not yet? The weight of his past mistakes was too much to bear alone, and so he turned to someone who had always been a steady presence in his life, Douglas. The older man had seen his struggles, had offered advice when needed, but now Lucas was desperate for guidance. "Do you think I can do this?" Lucas asked, his voice quiet but full of emotion. "Do you think I can really change? Can I ever make things right with him?" Douglas didn't answer right away, his gaze thoughtful. "You can't undo what's been done, Lucas, but you can make a choice. You can choose to face the consequences. But remember, this isn't just about him. It's about you. You have to decide who you're going to be from here on out." Lucas nodded slowly, the weight of those words sinking in. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time he felt like he had the courage to take it. Back at home, Henry wrestled with his emotions. The fear of losing his son, of losing the relationship they had built, felt suffocating. Could he really forgive him? Could he truly let go of the years of hurt? A moment of clarity came to him, sharp and undeniable. It wasn't just Lucas who had built walls. He had, too. His own pride had been just as much of a barrier as Lucas's mistakes. The realization hit him like a wave. He had been holding onto his own resentment, his own anger as a shield. It was his pride, just as much as Lucas's, that had kept them apart. Henry knew what he had to do, but as he reached for the phone to call his son, doubt crept in. Was he making the right decision? Or was this another mistake, another false hope? He dialed the number. The phone rang once, then twice. Lucas picked up. "Dad," Lucas's voice was hesitant, unsure. Henry took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "We need to talk." The future hung in the balance, and for the first time in years, Henry wasn't sure what would come next. The consequences of Henry's decision began to take shape almost immediately, and they were far-reaching, touching every corner of the Bradford family. For Lucas, the fallout was immediate and personal. He had expected some pushback, some struggle, but the weight of the emotional toll it was taking on him was heavier than he anticipated. His father's refusal to fully forgive him, the cold distance between them, felt like a constant ache, one that gnawed at him every day. Each failed attempt to bridge the gap, each unspoken word deepened the wound. His past actions, betrayal, lies, and the reckless decisions that led to this, had left scars that were impossible to ignore. Lucas couldn't escape them, no matter how hard he tried. Victoria, caught in the middle of her husband and son, felt the crushing weight of the divide between them. She had always tried to keep the peace, to be the bridge between Henry and Lucas, but now it felt impossible. Every time she tried to push Henry to let go of his anger, he pulled further away. You can't keep punishing him, Henry, she pleaded, her voice thin with exhaustion. He's trying. He's finally trying. You've got to meet him halfway. But Henry, always so certain in his own convictions, was unmoved. His silence was a form of punishment, and it cut deeper than any words ever could. He has to prove it to me, Victoria, he said, his voice low, tired. I can't just forget everything he's done. Not yet. It was a harsh reality, one that Victoria had hoped she wouldn't have to face. Every time she tried to step in to mediate, it felt like she was swimming against a current that was growing stronger by the day. She could feel the emotional walls between them, between Henry and Lucas, growing higher. The pain of the divide was palpable, and it seemed like nothing she said could break through. Douglas, ever the pragmatist, weighed in with his usual sense of calm. You need to let them figure it out themselves, he advised Henry one evening, his voice even as always. You can't force Lucas to change, and you can't keep waiting for him to come to you. It'll eat you both alive. But his words felt out of place now. It was too late for broad strokes of advice, too late for platitudes about time healing all wounds. The damage had been done, and even the wisdom of a man like Douglas couldn't seem to settle the rising tension. Lucas, determined to repair things with his father, tried once again. He showed up at Henry's office, his heart pounding as he walked through the door. "Dad," he said, his voice strained with both hope and fear. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I hurt you, but I'm trying to fix this. I'm trying to do better, please. Let me prove it to you." Henry didn't look up. The silence between them was thick, uncomfortable. Lucas stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of his own pride, his own insecurities pushing him back, even as he reached out. He could feel the old habits rising, those familiar walls of anger and fear that had always stood between him and his father. It was as if they couldn't move. He passed those years of disappointment, of broken promises, no matter how much he tried. For a long moment Henry said nothing. Then slowly he looked up. His gaze was unreadable, his eyes still full of wariness and unresolved hurt. "You say you're trying, Lucas," he said quietly, "but I've heard that before." Lucas's heart sank, the familiar sting of rejection hitting harder than ever before. He wanted to say more, to convince his father that he had changed, that he wasn't the same person. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he turned, walking away, the weight of his failure once again pushing him into the shadows. As Lucas retreated into his own thoughts, Henry sat in silence, the question gnawing at him. Had he been too harsh? Had the decision to hold back his forgiveness been the right one, or had it simply pushed Lucas further away? His heart told him it was necessary. Lucas needed to face the consequences of his actions. But something inside him was beginning to doubt whether the distance between them was truly helping. The tension in the house reached a boiling point. Victoria could feel it in every conversation, in every glance that passed between Henry and Lucas. The cracks were becoming irreparable, and she knew the family was nearing a breaking point. Everyone was dealing with the aftermath of the choices made, but no one was talking about how to fix it. And in the silence, the pain only deepened. The unresolved tension lingered, heavy and thick, leaving no one sure of what would happen next. Would they finally find a way to heal, or would this be the moment where everything came apart for good? The future was uncertain, and no one knew how the story would end. The call came at an unexpected hour. Lucas had been pacing in his small, cluttered apartment, overwhelmed by the weight of everything. His failed business, the fractured relationship with his father, the endless pile of mistakes he couldn't seem to outrun. He wasn't sure where else to turn, but he knew deep down that he couldn't keep walking this path alone. So in the quiet of the night, Lucas reached out to someone he hadn't spoken to in years, someone who had always been there, albeit from the shadows. It was Henry. It wasn't even Victoria. No, Lucas called Douglas, the man who had always seemed to have the answers. Douglas had never been a father to Lucas in the traditional sense, but there was no denying the influence he had over him, the quiet, steady presence that had shaped his worldview in subtle ways. When Lucas had been at his lowest, It was Douglas who had stepped in to offer a hand, to offer advice without judgment. "Douglas, I don't know what to do anymore," Lucas said, his voice raw and vulnerable. "I've tried everything. I've made all the right moves, but it feels like nothing's working. I need something, anything, to prove to my father that I can change." Douglas paused on the other end of the line. The air seemed to grow thicker as Lucas waited, uncertainty gnawing at him. After a long silence, Douglas spoke, his voice steady. "You can't keep asking for his approval, Lucas. You need to prove it to yourself first, but I'll help you. I've got an opportunity for you, one that could give you the chance to prove you're on the right path, but it's risky. It's not going to be easy." Lucas's heart raced. "What's the catch?" he asked, already sensing the weight of the decision before he even heard the answer. "The catch," Douglas said, his voice almost a whisper now, "is that you'll have to go through me. You'll need to follow my lead, and I'll expect you to take the steps I lay out for you. No shortcuts, no looking back." Lucas hesitated for a moment. It wasn't just about his father anymore. This was a chance to rebuild, to get back on track, and it came with a cost. But what choice did he have? He agreed. Unbeknownst to Henry, the new approach Lucas was taking, his sudden shift in tactics, began to raise red flags. Henry had always been quick to question Lucas's motives, but this was different. He noticed the subtle changes. Lucas was more composed, more calculated in his decisions, and it unnerved him. Was this real? Or was it another facade, another attempt to win his favor? Henry's suspicion grew with each passing day. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Was Lucas really changing? Or was this just another act? Victoria, on the other hand, began to notice the difference in Lucas. He was trying harder, not just in his business, but in his interactions with her and Henry. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope, to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for reconciliation. "I think he's really trying," she said one evening, her voice filled with cautious optimism. "Maybe this is the breakthrough we've been waiting for." But Henry remained skeptical. The wounds were still too fresh. He watched Lucas from a distance, torn between the glimmers of hope he saw in the fear of getting hurt again. Was he truly changing, or was this just another illusion? Then the unexpected twist came. Douglas, always the quiet observer, had a revelation that changed everything. He revealed to Henry that Lucas's transformation wasn't purely self-motivated. He had been working under Douglas's guidance, following a plan that had already been set in motion. "He's doing it, Henry," Douglas said, his voice carrying a weight of finality. "But it's not about you. It's about him finding his own way. You've got to see that." The words hit Henry like a punch to the gut. He had been so blinded by his own pride, by the belief that Lucas needed to prove himself to him, that he hadn't seen the bigger picture. Lucas wasn't trying to win his approval this time. He was trying to find himself, and in doing so, maybe, just maybe, he was also healing their relationship. As the weight of that realization settled in, Henry felt something shift inside him. He wasn't sure if it was enough to let go of the past, to forgive everything that had been done, but it was a step. And for the first time in a long time, he saw a sliver of possibility. Could this be the moment they'd been waiting for? Would it be enough to rebuild what had been broken? Only time would tell. The moment Lucas received the offer, he knew this was it, the turning point. The opportunity was massive, a business venture with the potential to restore everything he had lost and more. But it was also a risk, one that could bring him to the heights he'd always dreamed of or crush him completely. There were no guarantees. If it failed, it would be the final nail in the coffin of his career, his reputation, and his relationship with his father. But if he succeeded, it could prove that he was more than the failures of his past, that he could stand on his own, without anyone's help. He sat in his cramped office, staring at the email once again. The offer was real serious. This wasn't a simple deal. It was a partnership that could change everything, but it demanded total commitment, and there was no room for error. He needed to make a decision, and fast. But the weight of it all pressed down on him, the pressure from every angle, especially from Henry, whose disapproval still lingered in the air like a shadow. Henry had been quiet since Lucas's last attempt at redemption, still watching his son with the skepticism that had become a constant in their relationship. It wasn't easy for Henry to even think about trusting Lucas again. After all, Lucas had disappointed him time and time again. But despite the doubts gnawing at him, Henry agreed to support the venture, sort of. "I'll back you, but you're doing this on your own," Henry had said, his tone flat, his face unreadable. "No more handouts. You want to prove yourself, Lucas? Then handle this yourself. You make the decisions. You bear the consequences." Lucas had been grateful, yet there was a sting in Henry's words. Support came with a condition, no safety net. He had no choice but to take it. This was his chance, his moment to show Henry that he wasn't just the screw-up his father saw him as. But as the days passed, the weight of that responsibility grew heavier. Every phone call, every negotiation felt like a battle. He wasn't just trying to prove himself to the investors or potential partners. He was trying to prove his worth to Henry, the one person whose approval he'd been chasing for his entire life. Victoria, always the bridge between them, could sense the conflict in Henry. She could see how difficult it was for him to let go of the past, to trust Lucas with this opportunity. But she also saw the growth in Lucas, the way he was stepping up to the plate. She believed in him. "You have to trust him, Henry," she said one evening, her voice filled with hope and nervous energy. "He's doing it. He's making the effort. Don't let your doubts hold him back now." But Henry wasn't ready to let go. "I can't just erase everything that's happened, Victoria," he replied quietly, his jaw tight. "I'm not sure he's ready to handle this. The stakes are too high." Lucas could feel the tension building between his parents, but he tried to shut it out. This was his shot. As the opportunity unfolded, the stakes kept climbing. It wasn't just about the money, it was about everything. His reputation, his future. The weight of it threatened to suffocate him. Each decision felt like it carried the weight of his past failures, and every mistake could be the one that destroyed everything. Then disaster struck. A critical investor backed out at the last moment, throwing the whole deal into jeopardy. Lucas was on the brink of breaking, his hands shaking as he made call after call, trying to salvage what little was left. The pressure was suffocating, but he didn't give up. His resolve only hardened, determined to prove that he wasn't the same person who had failed before. He had to succeed. He had no choice. The family watched Ram the sidelines, holding their breath as Lucas fought to keep the opportunity afloat. Victoria stood by, praying for his success, while Henry's gaze remained distant, unreadable. The risk had grown even greater. Every decision felt like it was teetering on the edge of disaster. But Lucas pushed forward, his resilience being tested in ways he had never imagined. The future hung in the balance. As the hours ticked by, the family knew that the consequences of this decision would stretch far beyond just Lucas's success or failure. This could change everything for all of them. Would Lucas rise to the occasion, or would this gamble be his final mistake? Only time would tell. The tension in Lucas's office was suffocating. The once promising business venture had hit a breaking point. Negotiations had stalled, investors were pulling back, and Lucas's every decision seemed to make the stakes higher, not lower. This wasn't just a failed project. It was a crossroads that would define his entire future. Every move now felt like it could either propel him toward the success he had dreamed of or drag him deeper into the abyss of failure. It wasn't just his career on the line anymore. It was his dignity, his redemption, and his relationship with his father. Henry had been dragged back into the mess, reluctantly stepping into the role of advisor, but only from a distance. He still couldn't bring himself to trust fully, but now, as Lucas fumbled through the crisis, Henry felt a shift deep inside him. His involvement, even if minimal, was necessary. This moment might just decide everything. Was Lucas going to rise to the occasion, or would he fall again? Henry wrestled with that question, his own pride holding him back from fully stepping in, but his experience told him that this was the tipping point. He had been here before, had made the hard decisions, faced the consequences. But this time, he wasn't sure what the right thing to do was. His son's future, hanging in the balance, was far more complicated than anything Henry had ever faced alone. Victoria could see the turmoil in both men. She stood between them, trying to be the calm in the storm, but her own doubts and fears gnawed at her. She had always believed in Lucas, but now, as the situation spiraled, she couldn't help but wonder if he was ready for the magnitude of what he was facing. What if he failed again? What if, despite all his promises and efforts, this was the final chapter of his attempts to rebuild? She tried to stay supportive, tried to offer the words of encouragement she knew Lucas needed, but each day the pressure mounted, and it felt harder to convince herself that this would end well. The tipping point came as the decision weighed on Lucas like an anvil. He had one final opportunity to secure the funding necessary to pull the venture back from the edge. A key partner, the one who could turn everything around, was wavering. Lucas had a single shot left to convince them to commit, but it meant putting everything on the line: his personal finances, his reputation, and every ounce of trust he had left. The fear of failure clawed at him, but so did the realization that this was the moment he had been working for. If he didn't take this step, there was no coming back. His hands were shaking as he sat in front of his laptop, the email to the investor half-written, a risk that could either save everything or end it all. He had to confront his own fear of rejection, his past mistakes, and the heavy weight of his father's judgment. As much as he wanted to run from it, he knew there was no turning back. This was his decision, his alone. Henry, watching from a distance, felt something stir inside him. He saw the determination in Lucas's eyes, the way he wasn't flinching, the way he was owning the responsibility. For the first time in a long while, Henry allowed himself to see something different in his son. Maybe this time was different. Maybe he was really ready. But just as quickly as that thought entered his mind, the old doubts returned. What if this wasn't enough? What if Lucas wasn't strong enough to carry this through? The moment arrived and Lucas clicked send, his future sealed in the hands of someone else. As the email disappeared into the void, he sat back, his breath shaky. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope and fear collide. Victoria looked at Henry, her eyes filled with silent questions. She wanted to believe this was the turning point, the moment they would all look back on as the moment things changed for the better. But the outcome, for now, was uncertain. And as the minutes ticked by, all they could do was wait. The days following Lucas's decision felt like a slow unraveling. The weight of his choices, both the missteps of his past and the steps he was now taking to correct them, pressed down on him with every passing moment. He had secured the deal, but it wasn't a victory. It wasn't the success he had hoped for. The real challenge was the fallout, the toll it had taken on him, on his family. He was battling not just the external pressures of business, but the internal struggle of facing the person he had been and trying to become. Someone different. Henry watched, his pride and skepticism battling within him. He had agreed to support Lucas's decision, but the truth was he didn't believe this would be the turning point. He thought Lucas would fail like he always had. But now, as he observed Lucas making strides, slow, tentative steps forward, he found his own pride starting to crack. Lucas was struggling, yes, but there was something else in his efforts this time: real growth. Henry could see it in the way Lucas handled pressure, in the way he owned up to his past mistakes without excuses. It wasn't the boy who had once tried to hide behind pride and lies. It was a man trying to do better, trying to rebuild, to earn his place in the world. Victoria, who had been silently watching the dynamic between her husband and son, felt the strain in every exchange. She had hoped for a breakthrough, but as the tension lingered, she saw just how deep the rift went. Henry's pride was still a barrier, one that was suffocating not only him but Lucas as well. "You can't keep holding on to the past, Henry," she said one evening, her voice breaking through the stillness of their home. "Lucas is changing, whether you want to see it or not. You have to embrace that. You have to see it." Henry's eyes darkened as he listened, but a flicker of uncertainty passed through him. Was she right? Could he embrace this version of Lucas, this man who was trying to atone for everything? The question lingered in the air, unanswered. Henry had built a fortress around himself, around his emotions, and the thought of letting that down, of letting Lucas in fully, was terrifying. It felt like an admission that he had been wrong, that he had misjudged his son all these years. Lucas, on the other hand, felt the weight of his own reckoning. He was taking responsibility, yes, but the burden of his past choices, his mistakes, the hurt he had caused, still haunted him. He had made progress, but it was only the beginning. He was facing an uphill battle, not just in business, but in his relationship with his father. "I know I've messed up," Lucas said to Henry one night, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "But I'm doing the work. I'm not running anymore. I'm here trying to fix it. I'm not the person I was." Henry's gaze softened for a moment, the ice around his heart melting just slightly. It was the first time Lucas had spoken to him this way, without anger, without excuses. And for the first time, Henry allowed himself to question whether forgiveness was possible, whether he could release the grip of his own pride and let his son back in. The family had reached a moment of reckoning. They were standing on the edge of something fragile, something uncertain. They had spent so long living in the shadow of past pain, of old grudges, but now, as they looked at the damage and the progress made, they had to ask themselves, was this enough? Could they rebuild what had been broken? Could they move past the scars and find a way to heal together? In a rare moment of vulnerability, Henry and Lucas shared a quiet conversation in the study, the air thick with years of unsaid words. Henry's voice cracked as he spoke, and Lucas, for once, didn't flinch. They were two men, both scarred, both trying to find their way back to each other. But the future, even in that moment of understanding, was still uncertain. The road ahead was unclear, and while there was a flicker of hope, neither father nor son knew whether it would be enough to heal the wounds that had defined their relationship for so long. The reckoning was just beginning. The night was heavy with unspoken words, the air thick with tension as Lucas stood at the door of his father's study. His heart raced, his palms slick with sweat. This moment had been years in the making, a confrontation he had long avoided, one that had only grown more complicated with time. Tonight, there would be no more sidestepping. Tonight, he would face the man who had shaped so much of his life, the man whose approval he had spent years chasing, only to fall short every time. Henry sat behind his desk, his back stiff, his gaze cold. He hadn't moved when Lucas entered, hadn't acknowledged him beyond the brief glance. The silence between them felt suffocating, as though the weight of all their unresolved pain had made the space between them insurmountable. "Dad," Lucas began, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." Henry didn't respond immediately. He knew this conversation had been coming, but it didn't make it any easier. His mind swirled with anger, resentment, and fear. He had spent years protecting himself from the pain Lucas had caused, but now that his son was standing here, demanding something more, Henry wasn't sure he was ready to face it. Lucas took a step closer, his eyes searching Henry's face for any sign of softness, any hint that his father might finally be willing to meet him halfway. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Lucas said, his voice trembling but firm. "I'm asking for closure. I need to know that you're not holding on to the past anymore, that you see me for who I am now, not the person I was." Henry's jaw tightened. The words stung. They always did. But this time there was something different about the way Lucas spoke, something more genuine, more raw. For the first time, Henry heard the weight of Lucas's regret without any deflection or blame, but it wasn't enough. "I've watched you make mistake after mistake," Henry said, his voice steady but cutting, "and every time you've said you'd change, but you never did. How am I supposed to trust you? How can I just forget everything that's happened?" Victoria, standing in the doorway, felt the heavy pull of the moment. She had hoped for so long that this day would come, that the two men she loved would finally face each other and heal. But as she watched them now, the tension only deepened. Would this confrontation lead to healing or would it fracture them even more? She couldn't tell. Lucas's face twisted with frustration. I know I've let you down. I know I've hurt this family, but I'm not that person anymore. I've been trying to prove that to you, to everyone. I've been trying to fix things not just for you but for me. Don't you see that? But Henry couldn't bring himself to let go. The years of disappointment, the constant fear of being let down again, all those walls he had built around his heart, they were still there, still strong. You don't get it, Lucas, he said, his voice cracking just slightly. You can't just expect me to forget everything. You can't just expect me to forgive you just because you say you've changed. The words hung in the air, sharp and painful. They both knew this was the breaking point, the moment when everything would either come together or fall apart completely. Lucas stood there, his shoulders hunched with the weight of everything he had tried to fix, everything he had lost. Henry's stubbornness, his refusal to let go, was like a wall Lucas couldn't climb. The confrontation reached its peak, a raw, intense exchange of years of pain and regret. Henry's face hardened, and Lucas's resolve wavered. Both of them, for all their progress, were still locked in the past, still carrying the weight of everything that had been said and unsaid between them. Finally, Henry exhaled, his gaze softening just a little. Maybe I've been too hard on you, he admitted, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. Maybe I've held on to things I shouldn't have. Lucas's heart clenched, but the damage had been done. There was a crack, a fissure, but it wasn't enough to mend the years of hurt. They both stood there in the silence that followed, emotionally raw, their futures uncertain. A decision had been made, but neither of them knew yet if it would be the right one. They were on the edge of something, something fragile, something uncertain. The path forward was still shrouded in doubt, and neither father nor son knew how to begin the real work of healing. The days following their confrontation felt like a slow, painful crawl for Lucas. The weight of everything he had said, and everything that had been left unsaid, hung heavy on his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt the truth of the situation. His relationship with his father was broken, and no amount of effort could fix it overnight. Still, he knew he had to try. He couldn't move forward until he took responsibility, not just for his actions but for the years of mistakes that had shaped him into the person Henry saw. He had to rebuild everything. His business, his life, and most of all, his relationship with his father. Henry, though, remained a distant figure watching from the sidelines. He could see the changes in Lucas, the small signs of maturity, the way he was stepping up to take responsibility for his life. But Henry wasn't ready to let go of the past. He wasn't sure he could trust Lucas completely, not after everything that had happened. Every time Lucas made progress, Henry's pride seemed to get in the way, making him pull back. It was a constant battle within him. He wanted to help, to support, but the fear of being hurt again made him hesitate. Victoria, always the mediator, saw the tension growing between them. She knew the road to healing wasn't going to be quick or easy. You both need to take small steps, she said gently, her voice filled with the kind of quiet wisdom that had been a cornerstone of their family. You can't expect everything to be fixed in a day. Healing takes time. But even with her encouragement, the process felt painfully slow. Lucas worked tirelessly, showing a newfound sense of responsibility, taking on more in his business, handling his finances more carefully, showing up when he said he would. The changes were there, but they were small, tentative. Every step forward felt like 2 steps backward. The old wounds, resentments, regrets remained. For Luke. As the hardest part was not just fixing what he had broken, but proving to his father that he wasn't the same person anymore. But every time he reached out, Henry's response was still guarded, cautious, unwilling to trust fully. Henry couldn't deny the changes he saw in Lucas. It was hard to ignore the way he was taking ownership of his life. But the scars from their past, the years of disappointment, still hurt. Every time he looked at Lucas, he couldn't help but remember the man he had once been, brash, reckless, and full of broken promises. Henry wanted to believe that his son was different now, but the fear of being hurt again lingered, gnawing at him. Still, there were moments when Henry allowed himself to soften, brief, fleeting moments where he would offer a word of encouragement or a look of understanding. The cracks in his walls were starting to show, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. The road to redemption wasn't a straight path. It was full of false starts, setbacks, and moments of doubt. The family, though, began to take tentative steps toward reconciliation. It wasn't always easy. It wasn't always comfortable. But there was an understanding between them, an acknowledgement that they had all been hurt and that the only way forward was together, no matter how long it took. Lucas wasn't perfect, and neither was Henry. The healing would be slow, painful, but it was happening. Then one evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, there was a moment, a small breakthrough. Henry, for the first time in a long while, made a joke. It was awkward, but it was a sign. A sign that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way back to each other. But even as they shared that moment of tentative laughter, both father and son knew that healing would take time. The road to redemption was just beginning, and neither of them knew where it would lead. The healing process was slow. Every step felt like it was taking them further into uncharted territory. For Henry and Lucas, rebuilding their trust in each other was a monumental task, one that required patience, effort, and a willingness to face the past head-on. The wounds were still fresh, even if the surface had begun to heal. The tension between them had lessened, but it hadn't disappeared. Every conversation, every shared glance, felt like they were testing the waters, unsure whether they could truly bridge the gap that had existed for so long. Victoria, caught in the middle, watched as both men navigated the fragile territory of their new dynamic. She had always been the glue that held them together, but now she found herself stepping back more, allowing space for Henry and Lucas to figure things out on their own. It was painful, watching them struggle to communicate, to break through the barriers they had built, but she knew it was necessary. If they were going to heal, they needed to take ownership of their own progress. She could offer support, yes, but ultimately the work had to come from them. Lucas, for the first time in his life, was fully committed to the journey of change. He wasn't just trying to fix his relationship with Henry, he was trying to fix himself. He took responsibility for the choices he had made, acknowledging his mistakes without excuses, without trying to shift the blame. He began showing up in ways he never had before, keeping his promises, being accountable, and proving himself in small but significant ways. His growth wasn't immediate, nor was it flawless, but it was there. The more he took ownership, the more he started to rebuild the pieces of his own identity. Henry watched from the sidelines, still guarded, still uncertain. The walls he had built to protect himself from Lucas's past actions were hard to dismantle. Yet, as the days passed, something inside him began to shift. He started seeing glimpses of the son he once knew, the boy who had once looked up to him with wide eyes, full of admiration and hope. That boy, buried under years of disappointment, was starting to emerge again. It wasn't easy for Henry to embrace the changes. Old fears crept in, threatening to pull him back into the safety of his emotional walls. But little by little, he began to let his guard down. Not fully, but enough to acknowledge the potential for something different between them. The family, though still carrying the weight of the past, began to reconnect. The tension that had once been so thick was slowly replaced by tentative conversations, moments of shared laughter, and the occasional glimpse of hope. Yet even in these small victories, old scars resurfaced. Lucas would falter and Henry would pull back. The fear of being hurt again was never far away, but despite these setbacks there was progress. They were moving forward slowly, yes, but forward all the same. One evening, after another quiet dinner where the air felt lighter than it had in months, Henry and Victoria found themselves alone in the living room. The house felt different, the atmosphere here less tense, but the lingering question still hovered between them. "Do you think we're getting there?" Victoria asked, her voice softer than usual. Henry sighed, his gaze distant. "I don't know," he admitted. "I want to believe it. I want to believe that Lucas is really changing. But it's hard, Victoria. It's hard to let go of the years of anger and disappointment. She sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his. I know, but you've already taken the first step. We both have. We can't undo the past, but we can choose how to move forward. As Henry looked at her, he felt something shift inside him, a deeper connection, a new understanding. Maybe they were both healing in their own way. And as the night drew on, the family continued to take small, painful steps toward a future where, perhaps, the past would no longer define them. But with every step forward, the question lingered. Would it be enough to rebuild what had been broken? Only time would tell. A quiet stillness had settled over the Bradford household. It was the kind of silence that comes after the storm, the kind that carries with it the weight of the past but also the promise of something new. After months of tension, of deep-rooted resentment and hard-fought progress, the family was slowly finding its way back to each other. It was not a sudden shift, not an overnight change, but a gradual turning of the tide. A new chapter was beginning, one they were still unsure how to write, but one that was full of possibilities. Henry sat in the living room, staring out the window as dusk settled in. The house felt different now, lighter somehow. He had spent years holding onto his pride, building walls around his emotions, convinced that they were necessary for his survival. But now, as he looked back over the months of struggle, he realized how much of his own stubbornness had kept him and Lucas apart. He had spent so much time focusing on what had gone wrong, on all the ways Lucas had disappointed him, that he hadn't allowed room for change, for growth. It was a hard pill to swallow, acknowledging his own role in the pain that had divided them. But now, with that recognition came the possibility of something different. Lucas, though still wary, was beginning to understand this new dynamic. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was building something for himself, not something that existed in the shadow of his father's expectations or his past failures, but something that was truly his. He had moved out of the house months ago, found a small place of his own, and started working on a business that was all his. It was still small, fragile even, but it was his creation, not an extension of what Henry had built. It felt like freedom, but it also felt like a test. Could he really stand on his own? Could he live a life that was not defined by his mistakes, by his father's disappointment? Victoria, who had always been the thread that held them together, continued to support both men. But as she watched them now, something shifted inside her too. There was a peace in the house that hadn't been there before, a quiet understanding between Henry and Lucas that hadn't existed for years. The air was less thick with unspoken words, less heavy with the weight of old wounds. Yet even in this fragile peace, she could feel the uncertainty lingering. She could feel how much more work needed to be done. But for now, she allowed herself to hope. At dinner that night, the atmosphere was different. There was no arguing, no defensive silence. They ate in quiet companionship, the weight of their past struggles still present but not suffocating. Henry spoke, more than he had in months, sharing a small story from his day, and Lucas laughed, something that felt more genuine than any laugh they had shared in years. For a brief moment, they seemed like a family again, not the fractured one that had been torn apart by years of resentment, but a family that was beginning to heal. But even in this moment of peace, both father and son knew that things could never go back to what they were. Their relationship had been irrevocably altered by everything that had come before. But as Henry looked at Lucas, a sense of acceptance began to settle over him. It doesn't have to go back, he thought. It just has to move forward. The future was uncertain. There were still so many questions, so many moments where the past would rear its head. But in that small, quiet moment around the dinner table, the Bradfords, still scarred, still uncertain, began to realize something they hadn't fully accepted before. There was hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. And as the evening went on, the question lingered in the air. Would it be enough? Would this new beginning hold, or would the past pull them back again? Only time would tell. The sun was setting low as Henry and Lucas walked side by side along the quiet path that led through the garden behind their home. the air cool with the prom. Easy of evening wrapped around them, carrying with it the weight of the long journey they'd taken. For months, this path had felt like a battleground, words unsaid, grudges held tight. But now, with each step, it felt lighter, more like a road toward something new. Lucas glanced over at his father, his eyes searching Henry's face for the emotions he had never seen. There was a softness there now, one that hadn't been present for years, not since Lucas had been a child. The lines in Henry's face were still etched with years of struggle, of disappointments both given and received, but something had changed. They had both changed. "I never thought we'd get here," Lucas said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. He didn't know how to express the depth of what he felt, gratefulness, relief, even sorrow for all they had lost along the way. "I know I've messed up, Dad. I know I've hurt you, and I never imagined you'd be able to forgive me. But you did." He paused, his voice thick. "I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough for that." Henry didn't speak right away. He simply watched his son, taking in the man standing beside him now, not the reckless, defiant boy who had always pushed back, but someone who had begun to stand on his own, someone who was learning to own his mistakes and move forward. Henry's throat tightened as he took a breath, trying to find the words. Forgiveness hadn't come easily for him. It still didn't. The scars were deep, too deep for him to ignore, but for the first time he felt like the weight of his own pride had started to lift. "You've worked for this, Lucas," Henry finally said, his voice steady, though the emotion was unmistakable. "I'm not perfect either. I've made my share of mistakes, too." He paused, looking down at the path they were walking, his hands buried deep in his pockets. "But I know you're trying now, and that's more than I could have asked for." Lucas nodded, the words not quite enough to fill the space between them. The air felt charged with unspoken truths, but this was enough for now, enough to carry them forward. Later that evening, the family gathered around the dinner table for a quiet celebration. It wasn't grand, not by any means, just a simple meal to mark a new beginning. Victoria, ever the glue that held them together, smiled as she looked between Henry and Lucas. There was something different in the way they looked at each other, something she hadn't seen in years. Hope, understanding. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. As they ate, Victoria felt a swell of pride in her chest. There had been moments when she thought they would never make it, when the distance between them felt like an insurmountable wall. But tonight, as the soft chatter filled the room and the warmth of the family settled in, she knew they were moving in the right direction. The healing wasn't complete, but it was underway. In the kitchen, as Henry cleared the table, he stole a moment with Victoria, pulling her close. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded, her eyes softening as she rested her head on his shoulder. "We have, and it's not perfect, but it's ours." Lucas, across the room, watched them. There was a quiet sense of pride in his chest, too, but it was different now. For the first time, he felt like he was standing on his own, not in the shadow of his past mistakes or his father's expectations. He was building his own future, and it was something he had earned. He was self-sufficient now, not just in business but in life. He was ready for whatever came next, no longer waiting for permission, no longer looking for validation from anyone but himself. As they sat together at the table, the scars of the past lingered, but they were no longer the defining force in their lives. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt, times when the past threatened to pull them back into old patterns. But for now, they were taking a step forward, together. And as they finished the meal, Henry and Lucas exchanged a quiet glance across the table. There was still so much left unsaid, so many things they still had to work through, but in that moment they both knew one thing for sure. The road ahead would not be easy, but together they had finally begun to heal, a bond stronger than ever, built on understanding, growth, and the kind of forgiveness that can only come after a long and painful journey.